Hello everyone, welcome to today's session. In this session, we will learn about the user input. So, I'm going to clean this up and we can move on to the next concept. So, now let's go back to the example where we calculate the number of hours and we do that for four different values. Now, if you want this application to be really useful for us or somebody else, it doesn't help that we have to fix it here, just four different values, right? The application should be able to take any value that we basically fit it. So, we should be able to provide any number of days and the program should calculate the number of hours in those days. So what we need here is user input. And when we give this application program to somebody else or use it ourselves, it should allow some user input. So how do we write a program that asks for and accept a user input and then does some kind of calculation, some kind of other logic based on that user input? Accepting a user input from a Python application is actually pretty easy. Let's get rid of all of these lines first, and we can do that by writing input. And this will basically give a user a prompt to enter some input value. Now you probably already see from the syntax that this looks very much like using our days to units function, in this case with the parameter. So input is actually a function that Python provides us with, so we didn't have to write this input function. We wrote the days to units function, but input function is available in Python so that we can use it whenever we want. And this parenthesis here tells Python we want to call an input function and we are calling it or using a function without a parameter. So now we know that we can write functions ourselves for logic that we need, but Python has tons of functions that Python developers already wrote and is part of Python, and we can use it in our code. So that not everybody has to write their own input function, logic, and the code. All the functions that Python provides are again part of this Python that we use in a project. And obviously, if you are using the latest version of Python, you will get the latest code and latest functions that Python generally provides. So, back to our function execution, and let's see what happens when we execute this program. I'm going to run it, and in the outputs, you actually do not see anything other than my cursor is blinking here. So it's actually waiting for user input. So I can actually type in something here. So I can do 50 and enter and process finished with exit code. So I was able to input something that doesn't really matter. It could also be that a string actually doesn't really matter and the program generally finishes. So that's the simplest uses of input. However, as you noticed here, running this program and generally having this blank output here is a little bit confusing. So if another user is using our program, they will probably be wondering what's happening here. So what we can do is in input function, we can provide a parameter that actually tells a user something like enter a value for number of days or something similar, so that it's not just a blank prompt. So we can do that by passing in a parameter a string which is going to be our message. So we can do, hey user, enter a number of days and I will convert it to hours. And here you see, right, now that the program wasn't finished because we didn't enter anything. So this program finished line wasn't output yet, and that means the program is still running. It is still waiting for our input. And in PyCharm, in this IDE, if you want to terminate the program manually yourself, you can click this stop button and as you see, process finished. So now we can run the program again, and as you see here, we already have a message that we are displaying to the user so that they can enter the hours, right? And here we can provide our input 40 and there you go. However, this doesn't look nice here. We actually want the user to get a prompt on the next line. How do we do that? As part of a string, we can actually add a new line or a new line character basically, and that in programming in actually represented by backslash n, and you see a special highlighting for that one. Now let's execute and you see that my cursor is on the next line now, and again let's provide a value, enter, and program ended. So we have now a more user friendly way of asking program user for their input instead of just showing an empty prompt and we are getting user input. Now we are not doing anything with that user input, right? That input basically just finishes the program and that's it. We're not doing any calculation for that input. So how do we use the value that user enters here when input function gets executed? We do that, and this is a very important concept. By assigning whatever result this function uses gives us, which is in this case user input, assigning that result to a variable. So right now it's generally executed and it's just wasted, right? It just disappears. So instead we want to save that value, that entered input value, in a variable so that we can access it later. And we do that by, let's call it user input variable equals. So just like we created variables here with variable name and a value, right, or even an expression, if we did a calculation here, that will be generally a whole expression, whole calculation. The same way we can use values that function execution gives us to assign it to a variable. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to print the user input so that we can see what values that user input variable has. So let's execute again. It asks for our input. Let's put 50 and print user input gives us 50. So the user input variable value generally becomes whatever we provide as an input. Now that's a new concept and it should be a little bit confusing. So let's see another example with our own function. What would happen if we assign the value of this to a variable? We get a warning as you see here in the editor, which is one of the great things about IDEs that it basically gives you warnings when something is not correct, and the warning says function doesn't return anything. So if we want to have some value as a result of function execution, we have to return some value in the function. And how do we do that? Instead of printing the value right away, we can actually return that value using return keyword again. You see special highlighting here, just like here, because return is a special word that Python understand that you want to generally give back a value. This value right here as a result of using the function. So you could have some logic here doing the calculation, whatever, and then as the last line, you can return that calculated value, and now the warning is gone because we are actually returning something from the function. And when we return value from a function again, we can assign it to a variable so that we can use that value whatever function is returned by referencing the variable, and one of the uses will be generally just to print it, just like we did before, like this. Let's delete it temporarily and test our program, and there you go. You see that this function got executed with input 50. This text, this displayed text was put together in the function and was returned or was given back as a result, and we save that this whole string, this whole sentence in a variable called myvar, and when we print that myvar, we see that value printed out here, and again if we enter some other value we would get different text, and again that is actually a very important concept of giving back some result from a function execution. And you saw in our examples that you can have a function that doesn't return a value, just print something on, maybe it is something else, or function that returns some value. You can have both types. So back to our example of user input. So now hopefully it makes sense that input function returns whatever value the user entered as a result, and we can save it in a variable and then access it later. Again, let's get rid of this line, and now let's actually do the calculation on the user input number of days. How do we calculate number of days? Very simple, by calling our function that actually does that. So we are going to call our function to calculate the number of hours for an input, and the parameter that we passed in is going to be whatever the user provided. So instead of basically hard coding a value here ourselves, we give it a value that a user provided instead. So the number of days will be the user input, and now again, because this function returns the whole string, it doesn't print it. Remember, it just returns it. So when I execute this and I provide in some value, that's to 300, you see that I don't have any output here because we didn't print anything. We generally just return the value here. We didn't do anything with it. So the last piece missing here is to display the text that string that function returns. So we save that return value first. Let's calculate the value. So we save this thing in a calculated value variable, and finally we can print it. And now let's execute it and let's see what happens. I'm going to type in 20 days and let's see what we get now. And you see, we have this weird value here as a result of this calculation. So what exactly happened? So this part of calculation which represent this number didn't do a proper calculation. And the reason for that is because the input value that we get with input function is always treated as a string and not a number. So basically at this place here, number of days inputs 20 here is actually treated as a text and not a number. And where this weird result comes from, it number 20 printed out 24 times. So instead of doing the actual calculation 20 times 24, 20 is printed 24 times, and that's what happens when this is interpreted as a string. So how do we make Python see that number, see that input value as a number, as an integer, and not a text or not as a string? And it's actually pretty easy to do. On the next line, the user inputs again, we saw right here, it is a string. So we have to make it into a number, and we are going to do that using int and user input, and that process of turning a value from one data type into another is called casting. If you remember, we already saw an example of it when we turned a number into a string. In the string concatenation example again, from the syntax, you should already know that this is a function call. So we are calling a function called integer again, that Python itself provides us with, because we didn't write that function, and we are passing in one parameter which is a string, and we should get an integer from that string as a result, and we can save that number into a variable, and let's call it user input number. And now we have 20 as a number instead of as a string, and instead of passing in that string user input, we can now give our function number, that is expects. Let's save it and execute. Let's put in 20 and there you go. Now the calculation is correct. What I want to show you now is how this user input actually works without a code editor like PyCharm. So I'm gonna copy all this code and let's go back to our terminal, and I'm going to paste it in our code, and let's see how the user input works when we execute it in a simple terminal window. And as you see here, we have the message first and the prompt is right here. So we can enter a value. Let's do 35 enter, and we have a result. 35 days are 850 hours. Great! So our program is working. It is converting the number of days to the number of hours and accepts a user input. So this is all about today's session, which was based on the concept of the user input. In the next session, we will work on the next coding concept. If you guys have any doubt or any question, you can ask me in the comment section. Thank you so much for watching our video.